Hello, I'm Anastasiya Lavrina and I welcome you to Inside Politics. This November marks a constructive moment for the South Caucasus. Following the recent visit of Azerbaijani experts to Yerevan, Armenian experts have now arrived in Baku, continuing a reciprocal dialogue that reflects growing confidence, openness and a willingness to engage beyond official channels. It does not resolve long-lasting issues, but it signals movement, and importantly, mutual readiness to keep talking. Regionally, this fits into the broader search for stability, connectivity, and more predictable post-conflict environment. Globally, Azerbaijan's evolving ties with Washington are adding new diplomatic and strategic dimensions, reshaping how international actors view the region and its future. Today, we discuss the regional context, global implications, and the road ahead with our guest, Matthew Bryza, former U.S. diplomat. Ambassador Bryza, welcome to Inside Politics.
Thank you very much, Anastasiya. Great to be with you.
Thank you for joining our program today. And let me start with this question. So how do you assess the recent sequence of expert exchanges? Azerbaijani voices in Yerevan and Armenian experts now in Baku. Do they meaningfully strengthen the peace process?
Well, I don't know what they discussed. I haven't seen any statements from them. But in principle, that's a very important step. During my days as a U.S. official and as the U.S. co-chair of the Minsk group, it was not possible for the NGO representatives from Armenia and Azerbaijan to meet in each other's capital cities. They did meet from time to time, mostly in Tbilisi, and they were always preparing or trying to prepare the political landscape such as they could to get each side ready for a peace agreement. But in those days, so between 2005, 2009, 10, even the NGO leaders were not able to conceive of overlapping positions that the other side would accept. So now we're in a totally different place where now we have a peace treaty that's been agreed in principle, will hopefully be signed soon. And now I think these meetings by the non-governmental organizations of each country in each country's capital can play a significant role in moving forward the peace, the climate of peace.
Well, Ambassador, taking into account your broad experience as a diplomat, at what point do symbolic gestures become political pressure for a peace treaty?
Oh, they don't matter in this case. There's no pressure that these symbolic gestures can apply. The peace treaty is written, as we know. As I just said, it was initialed by the foreign ministers of Azerbaijan and Armenia in the White House back in August of this year. So now the only real obstacle is that Azerbaijan is waiting for Armenia to amend its constitution, as we know about, to eliminate the any ambiguity about whether it's conceivable Armenia might have designs on Azerbaijani territory. And that, preparing the population of Armenia to accept that amendment, is a very important role that the NGO community can play and that these symbolic meetings can play. But it's not pressure. I think at this point, these organizations that foresee themselves helping to prepare their societies to accept the peace treaty that's already been drafted and agreed in principle.
So is the peace process moving forward because the region is ready or because the world's attention has shifted elsewhere?
The peace process moved forward because Azerbaijan and Armenia, their leaders, decided to pursue the peace treaty, and that was made possible by Azerbaijan's, of course, it's reconstituting its territorial integrity and control over all of Azerbaijani territory in formerly what was called Nagorno-Karabakh and the 7 occupied territories. That's what enabled peace to happen, and President Aliyev used military force as a diplomatic tool, and military force and the threat thereof is a diplomatic tool. And so he used that tool successfully for Azerbaijan, and that's what has allowed the peace process to move forward. In addition, though I should be fair and say President Trump has played an important role. The meeting that he convened in the Oval Office last August 8th, and the agreements and announcements that came out of those meetings were very significant. And judging by the commentary of President Aliyev himself and Prime Minister Pashinyan, who say as much, that President Trump really helped to energize the peace process. But already the two countries, without mediation, without any more Minsk group or intervention by any big countries, had gotten to the point where, as I said last March, that the countries finalized the text of the peace treaty. Now it just has to be signed by the presidents, and that requires that amendment of the Armenian constitution.
Absolutely. Do you believe the post-conflict reality in the South Caucasus now favors long-term cooperation, or is it still fragile and easily reversible?
Well, of course it's fragile. The momentum is strong, but as we've been saying, the peace treaty is not agreed. So technically, from a legal perspective, the war is not over. For all practical purposes, of course it's over. But there are plenty of people in the South Caucasus, some of them in Russia, some of them in Armenia, could be a few in Azerbaijan, who don't want peace. And I think that the last thing President Putin wants to see now in Azerbaijan-Armenia relations is for the Zangezur corridor, or the Trump Road for International Peace and Prosperity, to go forward, as was agreed in the Oval Office last August. Because according to the agreement reached between Azerbaijan's and Armenia's leaders, that corridor will be operated by U.S. companies rather than being controlled by Russian FSB troops, as had been announced way back on November 10, 2020, in the three leaders' tripartite statement that announced a ceasefire, as well as other factors, which was signed, as we know, by President Aliyev, President Putin, and Prime Minister Pashinyan. So this new arrangement of the TRIP, the Trump Road for International Peace and Prosperity, lacks the provision of the November 10, 2020 agreement that would called for Russia's FSB security troops to control the corridor. And that's something President Putin, of course, does not like and seems to reject.
Well, Matthew, but still, if there is something Russia can do in order to interfere or affect the future negotiation process between two sides, or you think Russia is too more concentrated on the situation around Ukraine and the next negotiations process with the participation of Donald Trump?
Well, there's plenty Russia can do and is doing in Armenia, because to have a full peace means the treaty must be signed by President Aliyev and Prime Minister Pashinyan. And again, that from President Aliyev's perspective requires Armenia to amend its constitution. A constitutional amendment like that is extremely unpopular politically in Armenia. And to have it approved requires a supermajority of the parliament of Armenia, so that means 2/3 majority, which will be very difficult to achieve now. And then there are elections coming up, of course, in spring, in June, in Armenia for the parliament. There'll be a new parliament, therefore. And just as Russia and its services interfered in the U.S. presidential election of 2016, tried in 2020, did the same in the French presidential elections, it's inconceivable that they wouldn't be doing the same in Armenia's elections, hoping to undermine the success of Prime Minister Pashinyan. And if Pashinyan loses, and revanchist and more extreme nationalist political forces come to power again in Armenia, then I think there's very little chance that Armenian parliamentary constitutional amendment will be approved. And then we're in a very difficult situation of diplomatic stalemate.
Well, Matthew, so what's the next trust-building action that will send a real signal?
Well, I mean, passage of the amendment in the Armenian parliament. And how Prime Minister Pashinyan is able to shape his political reality to make that amendment possible is beyond my knowledge. I think beyond anyone's knowledge. It's the sort of monumental national task that any person is expected to be able to pursue as a national leader. And it will require extremely difficult political compromises. You know, I mean, think of in the past when, back in 1999, when Armenia and Azerbaijan previously were close to, at least they were making some real progress toward a framework agreement, not a peace treaty, but a more modest framework agreement. Well, remember what happened in the Armenian parliament, where the speaker and prime minister were murdered. So I'm certainly not saying I expect Prime Minister Pashinyan to be killed. I wish him great health and success because we need to see this peace treaty. But you know, there are precedents for horrible things happening, being perpetrated by those who oppose peace with Azerbaijan.
Well, but in any case, there will be the changes in the Armenian political system or in the American political system in a year, in 5 years, doesn't matter. So as for now, can new transport or energy corridors truly become a stabilizing force between Azerbaijan and Armenia, or could it generate new competition between the global powers?
Well, I think that definitely a new transit corridor with natural gas pipelines and highways and railroads will be a highly stabilizing factor in the South Caucasus. What is destabilizing would be if Russia tried to prevent that corridor from happening and or tried to prevent the peace treaty from happening by undermining the political climate and political support for Nikol Pashinyan in Armenia. So the more that facts on the ground change and generate new patterns of economic cooperation, which lead to political cooperation, which then lead to security cooperation, the more durable will be the peace, regardless of opponents of such progress in the region. So, you know, we saw the same thing with the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil and South Caucasus gas pipelines. The working on those projects was my introduction to the South Caucasus. And throughout that period, many observers said, well, Russia will oppose these pipelines, as will Iran. And our approach was, they're entitled to their opposition, but we are going to change the facts on the ground by working with the governments of the relevant countries, with private companies, with state companies, and with investors, and just create a new reality. And it worked. And we saw that the cooperation between Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey really strengthened, to the point that that same corridor that the pipelines run through became a corridor that the United States used to respond to the terrorist attacks of September 11th. And the corridor was then used to move material and people into Afghanistan. So what I'm saying is these sorts of transportation infrastructure projects, by definition, create new and could be strong and durable patterns of international cooperation, even if some actors don't like them.
Right, and one more question I have. How can Washington contribute to a more stable and predictable South Caucasus without overshadowing regional actors or creating new geopolitical tensions? Let's say, what's Washington not doing but should be at this stage?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's exactly, I think, what President Trump's objective is. So President Trump doesn't care about geopolitics. He doesn't care about democracy in the South Caucasus or even in the United States. He's not interested in history. He doesn't understand sort of the traditional U.S. national security interests and the importance of working together with allies. He's transactional. He admires President Putin. He admires President Erdogan. He clearly likes President Aliyev. And so President Trump wants to cut deals. He wants to build new infrastructure projects that create opportunities for American companies and investors to make money, and to do so in a way that also benefits the countries. That is something that is not in any way threatening to other actors. Trump has no desire to isolate Russia or isolate Iran. He's looking for ways to broker a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, and he may be interested in restarting negotiations with Iran on its nuclear weapons program. President Trump has made clear he was not in favor of regime change when it looked like Israel was maybe back in June, maybe going to pursue regime change in Iran. Trump, by all news reports, told President Netanyahu that the U.S. would not allow that, wouldn't accept it, therefore wouldn't support Israel, is what I mean. And after the U.S. bombed Iran's nuclear facilities, one of the first statements that President Trump made in reaction was, okay, now maybe Iran will be ready to sit down with us and have a fruitful and substantive negotiation on preventing it from developing a nuclear weapon.
Well, Matthew, thank you. Thank you so much for joining Inside Politics today.
Thank you, Anastasiya. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. So that's all for tonight's episode of Inside Politics. Positive steps from reciprocal expert visits to a calmer regional atmosphere remind us that peace is not an event, but a process built through dialogue, confidence, and patience. The South Caucasus is still navigating its future, but the direction increasingly points toward cooperation rather than confrontation. My sincere thanks to Matthew Bryza, former U.S. diplomat, for his insight and perspective. And thank you for joining us. Stay informed, stay engaged. I'm Anastasiya Lavrina. See you next time on Inside Politics.